Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha TV. When we talk about history and history of politics in our country, in India, we talk about the history of kings, courts, battles and wars. We talk about the social and cultural existence of mainstream majorities. There is very less to know about the majority which is marginalized. Today, from the 75th Indian History Congress venue in Jawaharlal Nehru University, we have Professor Sudha Pai with us. Professor Sudha Pai, you have worked on various aspects of political science and especially on Dalit issues. When we use this term Dalit politics, what that means actually in Indian history, in Indian history of Indian politics?
The term Dalit is very recent. It was used by Ambedkar because it's a Marathi word, but not with the kind of connotation it has today. Earlier words which were used were words like Harijan, untouchable, scheduled caste also came up in 1935. The term Dalit is the result of social movements in the country and struggle by the untouchables. So the difference is it's self-given. And there is a certain pride in one's lower caste identity. So in that sense, it's very different from any earlier term that is used.
But they existed in our society for a very long time.
Yes, they existed for a long time.
Even if the term comes very later, how you see that, how they existed in the history and in the politics of this country? How important were they? What was their role in the politics of India?
Well, there is very few historical accounts of marginalized sections, because as you said, history is largely about kings, about wars, about the elite, about invasions and so on. There is very little of social and economic history which was written until very recently. So understandably, disadvantaged groups like what we call Dalits today were not much written about. There is something written about them, but not about their social condition. True that for the last 2000 years they've been seen as untouchables, as marginalized, as living outside cities and performing certain kinds of duties within the Varnashram Dharma. But how they managed, what was their history, very little is written. But I must tell you that in recent years, Mayawati and others have attempted to go backwards into history and to create Dalit heroes and heroines. In UP, for example, they have identified certain figures in the past, Uda Devi, Jalkari Bai, and so on. So there is an attempt today to create a history for people who don't seem to have much history. So that is how it stands, because until recently historians did not really look at the lives of such people. It's only from the colonial period onwards, and particularly after the rise of movements led by people like Ambedkar, later on Periyar, and so on.
But when we talk about the medieval period, we talk about the ancient period, there are many icons, and as you said, that when we talk about the icons from these chapters of his history, these phases of history, we actually see that most of the characters are actually the sincere, devoted characters in our mythology, in our history, and they are very sincere, very devoted to the court, to the kings or to the lords.
That's right.
Why there is no
revolt?
No evidences of their own history? Because in the mainstream majority, we see a folklore, we see a tradition which carries the history with them. Why in Dalit community we don't have those reflections?
I think one reason was that they, being marginalized, were not literate. Literacy came very late to what we today call the Dalits. Hence, they did not have written accounts of their own. Yes, there were low caste saints, what we call the Alvars, the Nayanars in the south, who sang stories and told about lower caste people. Or in Maharashtra, there were a lot of low caste saints and so on. Or you have Kabir, etc. Apart from that, nobody actually attempted to write a history of this group. And it's only now that people are projecting backwards and writing about them, because they were not deemed to be important. They were supposed to fulfill a certain role at the bottom, and that was it. Of course, there is the older Hindu documents, I mean, whether you call them Hindu or whatever, Manu's writings about, the untouchables and so on. But there are no accounts by Dalits about themselves. Very
But
few.
if we divide this country in regions, do you see that there is some scope
There is
of
a
things like
difference.
if we talk about South or if we talk about tribes, especially in the Northeast and on the other regions in the eastern side, do you see any difference from the point of view of this reflection about their
Well,
existence?
if you look at what is today the Mysore region, there was the Basava movement. But ultimately that was more of what we would call today the backwards rather than the untouchables, because it created the Lingayats and so on, that group. So in the south there was that movement, and it was around, I think, the 11th century, and Basava was somebody who revolted against the social order. You have the Mahima cult in Orissa, and you have the lower caste saints in the south, in Maharashtra and so on. Yes, in the southern part of the country there have been greater revolts against the caste system than in the north. I think there is one reason for it. Most sociologists tell us that if you look at the caste system, it's very steep in the south. You have a small number of Brahmins at the top, and then you don't have much of the middle caste, and then at the bottom is a heap of untouchables. Whereas in the north it's more, it's more gradual, the gradient. So there are a lot of in-between castes. Therefore the weight of the upper caste is there on the middle caste as well as the lower caste. So I think that makes the difference, and so you find the worst forms of untouchability in the south.
When we talk about the popular history, like what is told among the people, by the people, what we learn in our families, in our communities and societies, it is very often told that due to the invasions in medieval period, this entire disorder in the society and this emergence of caste structure and everything happened. Now, I just want to understand that how you see the politics of these kind of propagations, how true they are and how we should see it. And if someone is actually propagating, why they are doing it?
Well, there seems to be two kinds of theories about caste. One is invasion. The invader, is a conqueror, and therefore those who do not agree with him and those who are conquered by that invader, they are, placed at the bottom. That's one kind of theory which is there. The other is that caste is a labor distribution. It's a distribution, occupational distribution. The two are related because the conqueror, on the conquered areas made certain people do lower kinds of work. So these are two theories which are put forward. But for it to have existed for so long a period without any social change is very remarkable. It shows that Hinduism has a certain resilience, and the upper caste were able to manage to retain their hold over society over a very long period of time. Because in other countries you have status orders. You don't have something like caste in its true form. Status orders dissolved with modernization, but here they don't seem to have. And in that sense, caste is a very peculiar, aspect of our own society.
When we talk about comeback, ghar vapsi and other things in our time, in our present time, there is one question which needs to be answered and which needs to be conveyed to the people, is that how to see this conflict of Dalits being Hindus or not being Hindus. Are Dalits Hindu or they are not? If they are not, what is Hinduism for Dalits, and who are Dalits for Hindus?
Well, this question very interestingly came up in the colonial period. It was called the politics of numbers. You see, the Hindus were very keen that the what are called the depressed classes at that time should be counted as Hindu, because then they would be a majority. The Muslims were keen that they should be counted separately and they should not be counted among the Hindus, that they would be a third kind of a force. So the Dalits have become very aware, the depressed classes become very aware of their very special position and their bargaining position. And at least their leaders became very aware of it. They may not have been that awareness at the absolute grassroots. So this is a very old question. Where do they stand? When Sikhism arose, the Sikhs said we don't have anything called caste. But you know that there are untouchables among the Sikhs as well. So the caste system pervaded into the Sikh religion as well. In more recent times, Dalits were seen as part of the Hindu fold in the post-independence period and so on. The Arya Samaj in the colonial period also tried what they called Shuddhi, something like the Ghar Vapsi during the Anand Saraswati's time. But the depressed classes found that, you see, it's fine, you do Shuddhi, but in your own village, everybody knows what you are, so it made no difference. So the Shuddhi movement collapsed after some time. And there arose other movements against the Arya Samaj. For example, in the Punjab, Jurgen Smear's work about I forget the name of that group, but they attempted to form a new group of their own in the Punjab, and there was a revolt against various forms of Shuddhi by the depressed classes. In post-independence India, the Dalits were seen as part of the Hindus, and in political terms they were seen as supporters of the Congress party, that the Congress would protect them just as it would protect the minorities. It's only after the 1980s that they begin to realize everywhere, not just in North India, if you look at Tamil Nadu also, that's true.
Definitely.
That, they've had a bad deal, that they had supported the Congress or they had supported some other party in the South and they got nothing out of it. They neither got land, nor did untouchability disappear, and they were sort of used as vote banks. So after 1980, that is why the term Dalit comes up, because there is a certain revolt against the existing order, a challenge to the upper caste, and a desire to be seen as separate. Now, today, let's say if you look at the followers of the BSP, they see themselves as separate from the Hindus to some extent. But then
this question remains, and this is still the
and
conflict.
Some of them went into Buddhism. You see, Ambedkar said, I will not die a Hindu. But Buddhism itself is a part of Hinduism. So this is a very, very difficult question. Where do they actually stand?
Answer. We'll talk about the politics and the post-independence Dalit movements, their reflections, and where they are heading to after the short break. Professor Pai, coming to the question of other ideologies, you're talking that it is only after independence that they realized that where actually they stand, and they started claiming for their space and their rights in the political scene and in the social spectrum of this country. Now, how you see the role of socialist movement and left movement? Were they able to address the issues related to the Dalit uprising? Because during the independence or for the struggle of independence, the Dalits have a completely different thing. It was not independence from the Britishers. It was much more than that. So they were fighting for something more, which was needed to be corrected in the social order, in the political order. How you see that, what role these socialists or these left ideologies have played?
Well, at the point of independence, Ambedkar thought he would be part of the talks and the negotiation when actual independence was being discussed, the Simla meeting and so on. But ultimately he found that the British wanted to hand over powers mainly to the Hindus. The Muslims went to Pakistan according to them. They gave over to the majority and they said, you solve your internal problems. So he was extremely unhappy about it. At that time, in many parts of the country, there was a very strong movement for separate electorates. If you look at the Scheduled Caste Federation of India, in fact, they held very large number of movements outside the Lucknow Assembly, in large parts of North India and so on. There was also an anti-Begari movement in eastern UP, which very few people know about.
And Parsi movement too.
Parsi movement and so on. But at that point of time, nobody really thought much about it or wrote about it, because partition was taking place and there were the communal riots and the migration of people from between India and Pakistan and so on. Where the socialists are concerned, if you look at the PSP, SSP, those parties which came up after independence, I don't think they really dealt with caste much. Ram Manohar Lohia did, but the way he used caste was not very useful for the lower castes at all. I mean, he thought you could use caste as a weapon in politics in order to uplift people. I don't think he really succeeded in it. His movement was not very, very successful. The left ignored caste because their ideology was Marxism. So for them it was false consciousness. It just doesn't exist. And they paid a very heavy price for it, because if again you come back to UP, they had a presence in Eastern UP, the land grab movement, even right up to the 1960s. But once there was the split in the left and the CPI and CPM were formed, they deteriorated there, and they disappeared. In fact, if you look at the first MLAs of the BSP, most of them have a left background.
Yeah.
Interestingly. So the left did not know how to deal with caste. They thought class was the enduring reality. And it's very interesting that if you read Kanchiram's work, he says that caste is the only enduring reality for 2000 years. And that we've never been part of the Hindu Samaj, and we have been outside it, and so we have our own politics. I think this was a reality that even the subalterns did not really deal with, although they dealt with many movements, but they did not frontally confront the issue of caste. So I think that has been their problem. In recent times, I have heard that in Tamil Nadu, there is an attempt to bring the left and the Dalits together. I don't know whether that will succeed. I have read about it, but because if that happens in Tamil Nadu, they will have a much better presence. And if the left is able to bring all the various caste groups together, which have formed different parties and groups and so on, it would be a big thing. Because then there would be a presence of a non-Dravidian lower caste movement with a strong, there would be a strong presence of that in Tamil Nadu. So in that sense, the socialists and the left parties have not really done anything very much for the lower caste groups, for the untouchables.
By these Dalit movements in our time, they repeatedly say that if the globalization is, when the globalization was coming, and when they talk about its implementation, when they're talking about moving towards urban setups, toward the towns, toward the cities from the rural hubs, from the villages, when they talk about Macaulay, when they talk about English, these models of West, this ideology of capitalism, how actually it helps, or is it the right approach, or it is because they want to get rid of one thing, but there are plus and minus of other side also as well?
I think there are three kinds of movements where Dalits are concerned. One is parties. You can leave them aside.
Which are for the electoral politics.
Which are largely for. But there are two other kinds of movements. One is what I would call grassroots movements, which are very real, which many people don't know about, and which can be very violent, particularly in southern India. But we have violence even in North India at times. The other is what you can call middle class activism. I've called it that in some place I've written.
That's interesting.
Meaning that there is the rise, even among the Dalits, of a very tiny but influential middle class. This middle class is the product of post-independence India. That is, they have not seen the national movement, Gandhi, Nehru and so on. They only understand, let's say, their lifetime's reality, that is the younger generation which has come up. They are educated and they are far more aggressive than their parents. That is, they are very anti-Congress, particularly, it's many of them. So they feel, this middle class feels that you should use English, you should use modern weapons in order to get somewhere. So there are two kinds of things happening both at the same time. This urban middle class may not be able to help those at the grassroots. Those people require education, they require jobs, they need to be brought up. They are very much like the rest of the rural poor, very similar to the rest of the rural poor. These are groups who have come into the urban areas, managed somehow to get education, and have entered into the ranks of the more modern working class, even if it's at the lower level. So I think this dichotomy exists today, and it's only a very small group that is really propagating all this. For example, these Dalit chambers of commerce and so on. But their belief is that this middle class will be a vanguard, and they will provide a role model, and that they can use capitalism, they will harness capitalism and emerge. And then they also argue, if you look at the Bhopal document, that there isn't any middle class in the media, in academia, in the arts, and so on. So creating this is very necessary. It will give an edge to the Dalits. I think only time will show whether this will help the rural poor.
Coming to the question of party politics, like at one end we see that what reflections this middle class, which you termed very well, middle class Dalit movements and campaigns are actually shaping. But at the same time, when we see to the party politics of Dalits in this country, the biggest criticism to them comes in terms of the statues, the parks and all these things. I'm talking about Mayawati. Some people like it, some find it a matter of pride for them, but for some it is a only big reason to criticize these Dalit leaders of our time. My question is that the allegation of following the footprints of the same feudal and Brahminical society by these Dalit parties, how you see this allegation?
You see, I think one must realize that there arose a Dalit iconography, to use the words of Eleanor Elliot. For example, there is the statue of Ambedkar. It's a very powerful and a very compelling statue, in the sense that he's dressed in a modern suit. She tells you that he holds the constitution, he has his finger up and all that. And so he represents something for the Dalits in modern India. And this was started by one of the Dalit Panthers, I forget his name, because he believed that an iconography for the Dalits was needed, and it became very popular. When Mayawati became chief minister, large number of these were installed, although many people criticized them as land grab. You want a piece of land, so you put up a statue of Ambedkar and then you use it for other purposes. But it had a very powerful symbolic value. I don't think there is any doubt about that. But coming to the memorials and parks, yes, it's true, she could have spent the money on something else.
Yeah, like
on hospitals, on roads.
We are learning from the history, the same history which has actually, the history of suppression. The same history we are actually using for
Actually, if you go to Lucknow, it's a very historic city. There are these chaurahas. At every party has put up statues. At one point you will find Gandhi, another chauraha you will find Nehru, third one will be Deen Dayal Upadhyay, and so on and so forth. The only difference is she has created a park and she has put all statues in one place. Every party has used this. But then putting them in one place and making it a place where people can visit has its own value for the Dalit masses. Because many of them, if you talk to them, will tell you that it gives them self-respect and confidence and so on. So that's a way of looking at it. It's very easy to dismiss it, but it has a certain symbolic, cultural value which has helped the BSP, which has helped it consolidate all the scheduled castes behind it in large parts of North India, particularly UP. You see, at the grassroots level, there are a lot of difference between Pasis and Valmikis and Chamars and so on. Many of them don't intermarry and so on. But this kind of politics has united them insofar as voting is concerned. And that I think is a very big achievement.
At the end of this conversation, may I ask you that where you see that where the Dalits in our present time, in our contemporary time, in the contemporary history and the realities, where they are heading to now from here?
Well, that's a difficult question, because if you see it from the point of view of political parties, recently the BSP has done very badly.
Yes.
But if you really examine and analyze statistically the results of the 2014 elections, the base of the BSP remains with it. If you were to bring it down to assembly seats, practically everywhere it is the third party. In some places the second party. So in the first past the post system, it's a matter of how the votes were divided and who went with whom and so on, or maybe it's the Modi wave. But I think the BSP base is there. And I don't think it's a party that can be written off. Even if the BSP, let's say, disappears tomorrow, it will have no impact on Dalit assertion.
And there will be
Dalit-
some other option, there will be some other phase, there will
because
be some
at the
other pattern.
grassroots there is a certain kind of Dalit assertion which is much deeper, much wider and much older than the BSP.
Thank you, Professor Payat, speaking to Rajya Sabha TV. And for more coverage on Indian History Congress, please keep watching Rajya Sabha TV, and you can log on to our website rajyasabhatv.com. Namaskar.